The chandeliers of Ashwood House burned like frozen constellations trapped within crystal, scattering pale light over a gathering that had come not to celebrate love, but to witness its quiet execution. Beneath the gilded ceiling, whispers moved faster than breath, slipping between silk gowns and polished uniforms like blades wrapped in perfume. Lady Evelina Hartwell stood at the center of it all, still as a portrait that had forgotten how to age, her hands folded with practiced grace, though her pulse betrayed a storm no one dared acknowledge aloud. The room had always admired her composure. Tonight, it misread it as surrender. Lord Sebastian Whitmore stood a few paces away, elevated by lineage and certainty, his expression carved from the same restraint that had once made him admirable. When he spoke, the ballroom did not grow silent so much as it held its breath in anticipation of something irreversible. He announced the annulment with the precision of a legal sentence rather than a confession of a broken bond, each word carefully detached from feeling. No accusation of scandal was spoken, no hint of betrayal named, only the colder justification of incompatibility and duty misaligned. In that absence of blame, Evelina felt the deepest wound, for it suggested she had never been worth fighting for at all. A murmur passed through the guests, polite and venomous in equal measure, as if society itself were turning a page it had already judged. Evelina did not interrupt. She did not plead. Instead, she inclined her head ever so slightly, a gesture that might have been mistaken for acceptance, though it was something far more dangerous. Control preserved under collapse. In that moment she became not a wife dismissed, but a story being rewritten without her consent. Sebastian's gaze flickered toward her once, briefly, as though searching for the reaction that would absolve him or condemn him. He found neither. That absence unsettled him more than anger would have. Yet he did not speak again. The silence between them stretched, heavy with all that had once been spoken in softer rooms and earlier seasons, when hope still wore the shape of shared glances across candlelit tables. The decree ended, but the judgment did not. Guests resumed their breathing, though carefully, as if afraid of disturbing the aftermath. Evelina was expected to leave at once, her presence now an inconvenience to decorum. A footman approached, avoiding her eyes, offering the coat she had arrived in as though it were no longer hers but merely an obligation to be returned. She accepted it without hesitation, the fabric brushing her fingers like memory refusing to dissolve. As she descended the marble staircase alone, the grandeur of Ashwood House receded behind her, each step echoing like a sentence being left unfinished. Rain waited beyond the great doors, falling in steady silver threads that blurred gaslight into trembling halos. The night air struck her with merciless honesty, stripping away the illusion of warmth she had maintained for the sake of appearances. Only then did her hand move, almost unconsciously, to rest upon her abdomen, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for fatigue. Inside her silence, something fragile had begun to exist, a truth she had not yet spoken even to herself. The world behind her continued without pause, unaware that its judgment had already severed more than a marriage. Evelina stepped forward into the rain, each drop dissolving the last traces of the woman they thought they understood, while behind the closed doors of the ballroom, Sebastian remained standing, unmoving, as if realization itself had only just begun to arrive too late. Behind him, the ballroom resumed its artificial life, yet every conversation now carried the taste of speculation. Ladies leaned closer behind painted fans, speaking in softened tones about honor, inheritance, and the quiet cruelty of men who could sever devotion with the elegance of a signature. Some pitied Evelina, most admired the restraint with which she had been removed from their world, for society respected suffering only when it was neatly composed. Sebastian remained rooted in place long after protocol suggested departure. For the first time, the architecture of his decisions felt less like duty and more like absence. He recalled the early days of their marriage, when Evelina had moved through his estate like sunlight that refused to announce itself, warming even the coldest corridors without permission. He had mistaken her gentleness for fragility, and in doing so had never understood its strength. Outside, the carriage awaited her beneath the flickering lamps. The coachman lowered his gaze as she approached, sensing the weight of something irreversible without needing explanation. Evelina stepped inside without assistance, her posture unbroken, though the world she entered now belonged only to herself. As the wheels began to turn, Ashwood House receded into darkness, its windows glowing like distant accusations that could no longer reach her. Inside the carriage, silence pressed close. Evelina finally allowed her breath to falter, though no tears followed. Instead, her fingers tightened around a small object hidden within her glove, a keepsake Sebastian had once placed in her hand during a quieter season of their lives. It was not valuable in gold but in memory, and its presence now felt like both comfort and punishment. As the city blurred past the carriage window, she lowered her gaze again to her resting hand, the gesture returning with quieter certainty. Whatever had been taken from her in public had left something behind in private, something that would not be so easily annulled by law or language. And somewhere behind her, in a house built on reputation and restraint, Lord Sebastian Whitmore began to understand that silence had consequences far greater than any spoken verdict. But as the carriage turned into the narrow streets, a sealed letter waited at the estate gates bearing no name except a truth that would soon refuse to remain hidden any longer, and it was already marked with his crest in ink. Evelina Hartwell vanished from the world of chandeliers and whispered judgment as though she had been folded out of a story the moment society decided she no longer served its pleasure. Within days of the annulment, Ashwood House sealed its gates, and her name, once spoken with admiration in drawing rooms, became a delicate subject handled only in half-sentences and cautious glances. London did not forget her. It merely reshaped her into rumor, a figure of quiet scandal softened by distance and ignorance. In the salons of Mayfair, her departure was dissected with the precision of surgeons who had never seen the patient. Some insisted she had been unworthy of the Whitmore name, while others lowered their voices to suggest something more intricate, something unspoken between husband and wife that had fractured beyond repair. Lord Sebastian Whitmore, meanwhile, remained untouched by visible ruin. He attended Parliament, signed letters, and walked through society with the same controlled elegance, yet those who knew him well enough noticed a subtle absence in his gaze, as though part of his attention had been left behind in a room he refused to revisit. Evelina's journey away from London carried her not toward exile, but toward erasure. She took residence in a distant coastal estate under the protection of a distant relative, where the sea replaced the sound of gossip. There, in silence thickened by salt air and isolation, she learned the language of endurance. The world no longer watched her, which meant she could finally begin to hear herself again. It was there that she discovered the truth she had already begun to suspect in the final days beneath Ashwood's chandeliers. The faint certainty growing within her body was not imagination nor fear, but life itself, undeniable and quietly insistent. She did not weep when she confirmed it. Instead, she sat by the window long into the night, watching waves break against stone as if the ocean itself were rehearsing grief on her behalf. There was no name she could safely give this truth yet, only the understanding that it belonged to both her and the man who had already turned away from her. Months passed, marked not by calendars but by change and silence. Evelina's strength hardened in private, not into bitterness but into clarity. She moved through the estate with a measured calm, refusing pity from servants who sensed more than they were told. In the final months before winter, she gave birth in secrecy, far from London's gaze, where only the wind bore witness. The child arrived with a fragile cry that altered the shape of her world more permanently than any annulment ever could. She named him without ceremony, choosing instead to hold him close until names became unnecessary between them. In him she saw neither scandal nor mistake, but continuity. His fingers closed around hers with a grip that felt too intentional for something so new to the world. In that moment, Evelina understood that disappearance was no longer possible, for she now existed in two places at once. One in the world that had rejected her, and one entirely beyond its reach. Among the few possessions she had carried from Ashwood House was a silver pocket watch Sebastian had once given her during a brief season of tenderness they both had since pretended not to remember. It no longer kept time for her. Instead, it marked memory. She kept it not out of sentimentality, but as proof that what had once been real could not be fully erased by silence or decree. Sebastian, unaware of the life that had continued beyond his decision, moved through his days with disciplined distance. Yet letters began to arrive that unsettled the rhythm of his certainty. One, sealed in plain wax and addressed only to the father of a lost heir, was placed upon his desk without explanation. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the weight of its existence felt uncomfortably intimate. That night, as rain pressed against the windows of Whitmore House, Sebastian stood alone with the unopened letter in his hand. For the first time since the annulment, the silence around him felt less like order and more like accusation. And as he broke the seal, he did not yet know that everything he believed had ended in that ballroom was only the beginning of what would refuse to stay buried. He broke the seal slowly, as though the act itself might alter whatever truth lay within. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers, not from wind but from something closer to unease. As his eyes moved across the lines, the formal language of delivery dissolved into a single unbearable implication. A child born beyond his knowledge, a continuation of his name carried in absence rather than acknowledgement. The words did not accuse him, yet they stripped him with a quiet precision that no courtroom could match. Sebastian sank into the nearest chair, the weight of the letter pressing harder than any political obligation he had ever endured. For a moment he considered denial, the easy refuge of disbelief, but the detail within the message resisted such comfort. There were references only Evelina could have known, fragments of shared time, and one final note describing a feature of the child that mirrored his own childhood portraits kept locked away in the estate archives. Outside, the rain intensified against the glass, each drop marking time with indifferent rhythm. Sebastian finally looked up, though the room had not changed, only his place within it. What had once been certainty now fractured into something less stable, something resembling regret. And in the silence that followed, he understood that the annulment he had signed with such composure had not ended a marriage, but merely hidden its consequence from him until the world was ready to speak it aloud. Within the trembling silence of that revelation, every belief he held about duty, love, and consequence began to fracture into irreversible understanding, and silent devastation followed him. Evelina Hartwell returned to London not as the woman who had once descended Ashwood House in silence, but as a figure reshaped by absence and time. She arrived under a name softened by widowhood, though no grave had ever claimed her husband and no mourning cloth had ever touched her shoulders. The city that once judged her now failed to recognize the quiet strength in her step, though it felt it instinctively as she moved through its illuminated corridors of power. It was at a winter charity gala held within the refurbished halls of Montclair Palace that Sebastian Whitmore first saw her again. Time did not behave kindly in that moment, for it seemed to fracture rather than continue as his gaze locked onto her across the glittering hall. Evelina stood among guests who no longer had the right to name her, dressed in deep mourning silk that absorbed the candlelight rather than reflected it. Beside her stood a child of quiet bearing, no older than 5, whose eyes carried an unsettling resemblance to the Whitmore line that Sebastian knew too well. He did not move at first, though every instinct in him demanded action, for recognition is not always immediate when truth arrives wearing the face of consequence. When their eyes finally met, the noise of the gala receded into something distant and irrelevant, as though society itself had chosen to step aside from their collision. Evelina inclined her head with measured politeness, offering nothing of the collapse he might have expected, only the controlled elegance of a woman who had already survived her breaking. "Lady Hartwell," he said at last, voice restrained yet fractured at its edges, "I was told you were lost to the sea of distance. And yet here I stand," she replied softly, which suggests that rumor has once again mistaken absence for ending. The child shifted slightly at her side, looking up at Sebastian with unguarded curiosity that bordered on recognition without understanding its source. Sebastian stepped forward, the distance between them narrowing as though pulled by something neither politics nor pride could resist. "Who is he?" he asked, though the question already carried its answer beneath the surface. Evelina's silence lasted only long enough to become unbearable, the kind that reshapes air into accusation without a single spoken word. "He calls me Mama," she finally said, her voice steady in a way that suggested it had been practiced through nights of solitude. Something in Sebastian broke without sound, not loudly enough for the room to notice, yet profoundly enough to alter the architecture of his understanding. The music of the gala swelled again as if refusing to acknowledge the fracture forming within its guests, yet Sebastian heard none of it now. He extended a hand slightly, not in greeting but in hesitation, as though the act itself required permission from fate. "Walk with me," he said quietly, and though it was not a command, it carried the weight of inevitability. Evelina considered him for a moment that seemed to contain several lifetimes, then nodded once, allowing herself to be led through corridors lined with portraits of forgotten nobility. The child followed silently, his small steps echoing faintly against marble that once had hosted Evelina's exile. They stopped in a narrow glass corridor where rain pressed itself against the windows like memory refusing to dissolve. "You were never meant to return," Sebastian said, voice lower now, stripped of its public armor. "And yet return is not always a matter of permission," Evelina replied, her eyes unwavering. The child tugged lightly at her sleeve, looking between them as if sensing the invisible storm that belonged only to adults. "Mama," he said softly, "is this man the one from your stories?" The question struck harder than any accusation, for Evelina had never spoken Sebastian's name aloud in front of the child. Sebastian's breath caught, the realization arriving not as revelation but as recognition delayed beyond mercy. "Stories?" he repeated faintly. Evelina finally looked at him fully, and in that gaze there was neither forgiveness nor accusation, only the careful preservation of something that could still break if touched too directly. "He is not a story," she said at last, "though he has been treated as if he were a consequence rather than a truth." The corridor seemed to tighten around them, the air growing heavier with everything unsaid. Sebastian took one step closer, then another, until the distance between him and the child was no longer theoretical but immediate. "Tell me," he whispered, "what have I become in your absence?" Evelina did not answer at once, for some truths require silence before they are allowed to exist aloud. Instead she placed a hand gently upon the child's shoulder, anchoring herself in the only certainty she had ever chosen freely. The silence between them deepened further, until even the rain beyond the glass seemed to hesitate before striking the window, as if the world itself waited for Evelina to decide whether truth would be permitted to speak its final name aloud in the presence of the man who had once denied its existence. Sebastian raised his hand again, but this time it did not seek explanation so much as surrender, and in that fragile motion Evelina saw not the Lord of Whitmore House but the man who had signed away something he had not understood until it was already gone. The child stepped forward slightly, his small voice breaking the fragile architecture of their confrontation with unexpected clarity. "Mama," he said again, louder this time, "why does this man look at me like he knows me?" Evelina closed her eyes briefly, not in weakness but in the restraint of a truth long postponed, and when she opened them again they carried the weight of every unsent letter and every night spent choosing survival over confession in a world that had never offered her either without cost. "Because," she whispered, "he is yours," and in the instant after the words landed, Whitmore Estate stood beneath a bruised sky as Sebastian Whitmore returned to its halls not as a man of certainty, but as one fractured by truth. The corridors that once echoed with disciplined authority now felt like chambers of accusation, every portrait along the walls watching his return in silent judgment. Evelina Hartwell waited in the drawing room where she had once been cast out, yet she stood now not as exile but as reckoning itself made flesh. The child remained beside her, unaware that the silence between adults had already begun reshaping his inheritance. Sebastian entered slowly, gloves still damp from rain, as though even the weather refused to absolve him of what had been set in motion. "You should have told me," he said, voice restrained yet breaking at the edges of control he had spent years constructing. "I was not given the right to speak when silence was chosen for me," Evelina replied evenly, her gaze steady and unyielding. "The annulment was not what you think," Sebastian said, stepping closer. "It was engineered long before either of us had a voice." Evelina's expression did not soften, for truth delivered too late does not mend what it has already broken. A rival house had orchestrated the ruin in silence, forging correspondence, twisting reputations until Exile appeared as justice rather than manipulation. "I believed I was preserving honor," Sebastian whispered, "but I was only preserving another man's deception." Evelina turned away briefly, unable to accept apology that arrived after ruin had already learned her name. "Why are you sad, Mama?" the child asked softly, pressing closer to her side. Evelina knelt, smoothing his hair, her voice steady despite the storm gathering within her chest. "I did not know," Sebastian said again, though knowledge now offered no comfort or redemption. "You signed it without asking why I never defended myself," Evelina said, voice dangerously calm. "Because I trusted the world more than I trusted you," Sebastian admitted, lowering his gaze. A knock shattered the fragile calm, and a sealed notice was delivered declaring immediate custody proceedings. The words fell into the room like broken glass, cutting through whatever reconciliation had begun to form. "This is political retaliation," Sebastian said sharply, realizing too late how deeply he had been used. "And you were the instrument that allowed it," Evelina replied, her voice precise and devastating. The child clutched Evelina's hand tighter, sensing collapse in a world he could not name. "I will not lose him," Sebastian said, though whether he meant child or redemption remained unclear. "You already did," Evelina answered, "the moment you chose certainty over truth." The solicitor's warning declared evidence would be presented before the Crown within a fortnight. For the first time, Sebastian understood the annulment was not ending, but carefully constructed manipulation. Evelina met his gaze without pleading, her survival now speaking louder than any past affection. The Crown representative entered, sealing the moment that would determine custody and legacy alike. Silence fell so sharply even the child held his breath instinctively. "Over my authority," Sebastian said quietly. "He will not be taken without truth." Evelina turned slowly, realizing protection spoken too late still carried consequence if acted upon. Rain struck the windows like verdicts as officials advanced, forcing decision upon them all. "We will answer together," Sebastian said, stepping between Evelina and the approaching authority. Evelina studied him, weighing whether late loyalty could withstand years of betrayal. The crown seal rose again, and with it the final claim upon the child's fate. Evelina spoke at last, her truth carrying the weight of survival rather than confession alone. "Then let it be known," she said, "he is mine before he is anyone's legacy." And in that declaration, the room understood that love, once buried, had returned as defiance. The officials hesitated, for even law bends when confronted with certainty born of maternal resolve and paternal awakening. Sebastian stepped forward fully, his voice no longer restrained by fear of consequence or reputation. "I acknowledge him," Sebastian said, "not as claim but as truth I cannot undo." Evelina's breath caught, not in relief, but in recognition that battles rarely end where they begin. The child looked between them, sensing shift without understanding its full meaning. Court summons would follow, yet something irreversible had already begun within that rain-soaked corridor. Evelina turned once more, not away from Sebastian, but toward the future she now guarded. "Then we proceed together," she said softly, and for the first time he did not argue. Outside, thunder broke across London, as though the city itself recognized that inheritance had changed hands in silence and truth. The solicitor lowered the document, uncertainty flickering across his professional composure for the first time. Sebastian placed himself beside Evelina fully, no longer divided by past decree or social expectation. Evelina finally allowed herself a breath, not of relief, but of acceptance that struggle would continue. "We will not be divided again," Sebastian said, and this time no one questioned the vow. The crown officer marked the file unresolved, as though even authority hesitated before what had just been revealed. Evelina held the child closer, her silence now no longer absence but shield. Sebastian watched them both, understanding at last that legacy was not what history wrote, but what survival preserved. Rain softened outside the estate as Evelina and Sebastian stood together before the uncertain authority of law and lineage, neither fully victorious nor defeated but irrevocably altered by truth that could no longer be contained within silence or shame. The child remained between them a living testament to what had been denied and reclaimed, and as the crown seal finally lowered, Evelina spoke once more, not in surrender but in command of her own becoming. "No one will take him without knowing what they destroy," and in that moment Sebastian understood that redemption was not granted by apology but by standing when everything demanded retreat, and beyond the estate gates another letter waited sealed in silence, and the courtroom of Westminster stood colder than any winter Evelina Hartwell had ever endured, its high windows filtering pale daylight that fell like judgment upon polished wood and waiting faces. Every seat in the chamber belonged to expectation, every breath drawn within it shaped by the anticipation of legacy being decided not by love, but by law. Evelina sat upright at the center of it all, her hands folded with a calm that had been forged through years of silence, exile, and survival. Beside her, the child remained still, his small fingers curled around hers with a trust that had become both her strength and her fear. Across the chamber, Sebastian Whitmore stood as a man suspended between reputation and ruin, his posture composed yet visibly restrained by everything he had begun too late to undo. The Crown's counsel spoke first, presenting the annulment as lawful, precise, and final, each word designed to reinforce permanence rather than question it. Evelina listened without reaction, though within her stillness memory stirred, the night of Ashwood House, the descent into rain, the silence that had followed her into disappearance. When Sebastian was called to respond, he did not immediately speak, and in that pause the chamber seemed to lean toward collapse or confession. "I stand before this court," Sebastian finally said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier certainty, "not to defend a decree I now understand was built upon deception, but to confront its consequence." A murmur passed through the room, restrained but undeniable. Evelina did not look at him, yet she felt every syllable as though it touched something long buried and carefully preserved. The rival house was named at last, their interference revealed through forged letters, manipulated witnesses, and carefully constructed ruin designed to fracture Whitmore inheritance. The court record shifted subtly as truth replaced assumption, though not all illusions could be dismantled with equal ease. Evelina's gaze lowered briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition of how little justice required before it arrived too late. When Sebastian turned toward her, it was no longer as a man attempting explanation, but as one confronting the irreversible weight of his absence. "I believed I was protecting honor," he said quietly, though the word now sounded fragile in his mouth, "when in truth I was abandoning truth itself." Evelina finally spoke, her voice calm enough to silence even the chamber's breath. Honor that requires silence is not protection, she said. It is permission for harm to continue unchallenged. The words settled into the courtroom with unsettling clarity, offering no cruelty, only precision. The child shifted slightly at her side, looking up at her with innocent confusion that softened the severity of the room. "Mama," he whispered, "why is everyone looking at us like we are breaking something?" Evelina lowered her gaze to him, her expression gentling for the first time that day. "Because," she replied softly, "truth always looks like destruction before it learns how to become peace." Sebastian took one step forward, then another, until he stood not before the court, but before them. "If this child is to inherit anything," he said firmly, though his voice trembled beneath restraint, "then let it be truth unburdened by concealment." He turned then toward the assembled authority. "I renounce the annulment's finality," he declared, each word striking the chamber with deliberate force, "and I acknowledge my son not as claim of privilege, but as responsibility I should never have delayed." For the first time, Evelina's composure faltered, not into weakness but into something far more complicated: recognition. The chamber reacted in restrained shock, the legality of his declaration challenging the very structure that had once confined them both. Yet Evelina did not move toward him. Some distances, she understood, are not crossed by words alone. The Crown's Counsel attempted objection, but the momentum of revelation had already altered the balance of authority within the room. What had been a hearing now resembled reckoning. The final ruling was deferred, yet its direction had changed irrevocably. When the court finally adjourned, silence followed them into the corridor beyond like a reluctant shadow. Evelina walked ahead with the child, her pace steady, while Sebastian remained a step behind, as though unsure whether proximity itself had been earned. Rain waited outside the stone steps, soft now, less violent than memory. It was in the gardens of Whitmore Estate that what remained of their past and future finally converged without witnesses. The hedges stood damp with evening mist, and the marble path reflected fractured light from a sky no longer burdened with thunder. The child ran briefly ahead, his laughter breaking through tension neither adult had fully released. Sebastian stopped a few paces behind Evelina, watching her as she stood beneath the archway of climbing roses that once marked the entrance to her former life. "I do not ask for forgiveness," he said quietly, "because I no longer believe it is something I can request and receive." Evelina did not turn immediately. When she did, her expression held neither closure nor rejection, but the exhaustion of survival finally allowed to breathe. "Forgiveness is not what was taken from me," she said. "Time is. And time does not return simply because truth arrives." The wind moved gently through the garden, carrying the scent of earth softened by rain. The child called out to them from a distance, holding a fallen blossom as if it were a discovery meant to be shared. For a moment neither spoke, both watching him as though he represented a future neither had been permitted to imagine safely. "I will not ask you to return to what we were," Sebastian said finally, voice lower now, stripped of command. "But I cannot step away from what I am to him." Evelina's gaze remained on the child. "Then do not step away," she replied. "But do not assume presence is the same as belonging." The words were not rejection nor acceptance, but boundary, clear, unyielding, necessary. Sebastian understood them more fully than any legal decree he had ever signed. The child ran back toward them then, placing the flower into Evelina's hand before looking up at Sebastian with cautious curiosity. "Are you staying now?" he asked simply. Sebastian knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to the child's level, not as a lord, but as something newly uncertain and painfully real. "If I am allowed," he said softly. Evelina watched this exchange in silence, something within her easing not into forgiveness, but into recognition that endings were not always singular events. Sometimes they were gradual reshaping of what pain could become when no longer hidden. As dusk settled over Whitmore Estate, the three stood within the garden where nothing demanded immediate resolution. The court's verdict had not yet been finalized, yet something far more enduring had already begun to shift. Evelina lifted her gaze toward the fading light, then toward Sebastian, and finally toward the child who bridged everything between them. "We do not return," she said at last, her voice carrying the quiet authority of survival, "but we may choose what comes after."